Okay, so we're going to look at the nervous system and just do a quick recap of the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system, and have a quick look at some of the parts of the brain and spinal cord. So I think this picture here shows a good link between the flow of the spinal cord down through the nerve fibers and into muscle and skin. So you can see how it flows down here where we get our sensory receptors, and it travels up through the spinal cord and then up into the brain. So we'll have a look at different parts of those and how they all work. Okay, so starting with the central nervous system. So if we remember, it's the brain and the spinal cord, and all the information to and from the body to the brain goes through that spinal cord. So we're going to start with the cerebrum. So the cerebrum is the largest part of the brain and it has two hemispheres. We've got the left and the right. So you can see here, we've got our left hemisphere and our right hemisphere, and it's basically separated down the middle here. So we've got 1 and 2 on that side. So the interesting thing to note about these is that the right cerebral hemisphere receives all the sensations and controls all movements on the left side of the brain, or the left side of the body, and the left cerebral hemisphere controls sensations and movements on the right side of the body, so it goes to either side. So if one side was damaged, if you were to damage, say, the right side of the cerebrum, then the left side of the body is going to be the side that will be affected. So, if you're left-handed, for example, and you damage your right hemisphere, then you may not be able to use, your left hand for writing and that sort of thing. That's where it's really important to look at that activity in class, the bilateral transfer. So it's taking information that's from one side of the brain or used on one side of the brain, such as handwriting or kicking a ball or throwing a ball, and we transfer that information across to the other side of the brain. So it can be used in sporting situations, but also if there's injury, brain injury, and that type of thing. Okay, so the next part we're going to look at is the cerebellum. So if we look at this diagram here, the cerebellum is this bit at the bottom, down there. So it's quite small, as you can see, if we compare it to the cerebrum, but it's actually got as many neurons in that little cerebellum down there than both sides of the cerebral hemispheres have combined. So there's a lot. There's a lot of activity and information passing through there all the time. Basically, it's the control center for movement. So if we're looking at, moving body parts, going from place to place, that's all controlled, or a lot of it is controlled through the cerebellum. Unlike the cerebrum, though, so we looked in the last slide how with the cerebrum, the left side controls the right side of the body and the right side controls the left. With the cerebellum, the left side of the cerebellum controls actions on the left side of the body, and the right side of the cerebellum controls actions and movements on the right side of the body. So it's the opposite to the cerebrum. So it controls all the functions that way. And through the cerebellum, we have the brain stem and the pons, and that attaches down to the spinal cord. So we're going to have a look at those bits next. Okay, so moving on to the brain stem. So if you look at this part down the bottom here, this is the brain stem here. So we can see it's attached to the cerebellum, and that travels up and relays information to the rest of the brain. And we'll talk about those parts of the brain very, very soon. Basically, with the brain stem, it's the place where all the information is relayed to and from. So any sensory information that we pick up from the body, so temperature or touch, anything like that, is relayed up through the brain stem into the brain and vice versa. So once the brain's interpreted that information, it's sent back down through the brain stem down to the spinal cord. You can see it over on this second picture over here. So we have our brain stem, that comes through here, and you can actually see where all the fibers are running down that will eventually attach onto the spinal cord. So it controls breathing, it controls consciousness, it controls body temperature, so it's quite important. And it's the most primitive part of the brain. So when we say it's the most primitive part, it doesn't mean it's the least important part. When we talk about primitive parts of the brain, it's one of the longest standing developed parts of the brain. If we go back in our evolutionary, time, then the brainstem was one of the first parts or components of the brain that evolved. So it's the most primitive part of the brain. So as well as our breathing and consciousness and body temperature, you can see it's quite an important part. And if we look at the first two sections of the brain, so the cerebrum and the cerebellum, if those parts of the brain were to be damaged, you could still survive. Okay, so we've got the bilateral transfer, we've got the new neuronal pathways being made throughout the brain to be able to carry out activities. But because the brainstem has such important things, notably the breathing, if that was damaged, usually the person it will resolve or end up with a rapid death. You can imagine if you can't breathe, that's not too good. So that's our brainstem, and we'll have a little look later at the different parts of the brainstem and how that information is carried to and from. So the last little bit of the central nervous system is the spinal cord. So the spinal cord attaches to the brainstem, and it's like a pathway, basically, like a highway, a superhighway. So there's messages that are sent, to and from the skin, the joints and the muscles, so everything outside. And you can see from this first diagram here, so the brainstem is up the top and it carries all the way down the bottom to here. So that is the central nervous system, and then all these nerves that branch off from the side along here are all part of the peripheral nervous system. So it's carrying messages to and from. So we say it's a superhighway. So if we pick up a receptor, coming from our arm, for example, for temperature or touch, it's sent via the spinal cord up to the brain for interpretation, back down and back out to that particular body part. So if it needs to, move or whatever. Then if we break this spinal cord down and we have a look at the internal structure, having a look here, you can see inside it looks like the shape of a butterfly almost. And we have dorsal roots and ventral roots that consist in here. And you can see if we look over there, we have dorsal root filaments that takes information up into the dorsal horn, which is this coloured bit in the middle there, and that processes information. We also have the ventral root, which is down here, okay, and that can also convey information into the spinal cord. So it's quite protected. We've got lots of fibres that run through there, and we have a ton of nerve endings that carry that information from the rest of the body. Then it's coated in 3 layers, and over all of those layers we have the the vertebral column. So we have the bony part that acts to protect the spinal cord. So if that's damaged, then you can imagine how movement will be restricted. So when we look at paralysis, and we've mentioned in class, if people become a quadriplegic or a paraplegic, it's because they can't get the messages from the brain back down to the spinal cord. So if I just change colour up here, if someone was to, say, break their neck up the top here, the nerve endings, so the brain is still, sending messages out to the rest of the body to try and walk. Okay, and it's not that the muscles themselves don't work, it's just the message isn't getting from the brain to the muscle to allow it to actually work. So it doesn't mean the muscles are, not working. It just means the brain can't control it. It just can't get that message down because it's been severed. If you were to sever the spinal cord down further, say here, then you would lose movement to the lower half of the body, but you're still going to get messages that branch off to the upper part of the body. And because it's not affecting the autonomic nervous system, you can still breathe, you can still, heartbeat and that sort of thing. So just depending where you damage the nervous system depends on, how much movement that you'll actually have afterwards. So each spinal nerve attaches to the spinal cord by two branches. So you've got the dorsal and ventral roots that we looked at before. When we look at the dorsal roots, which are these ones, okay, that we looked at, they actually have axons that bring information to the spinal cord. Okay, so to spinal cord. So it comes from the rest of the body. Okay, those messages come from the rest of the body, and that will then go up to the brain for interpretation. And then back with these ventral roots down here, they actually take information away from the spinal cord. So we have brain to the body. Oops. Oh, bugger. Hang on. Oh, yeah. To the body. Okay, whatever. That's meant to say body, but if I put the Y in there, then it changes the page, so you can just do that on your own notes at home. Whoops. Okay, so just make sure you know the difference between the two. So dorsal takes to and ventral takes away. The dorsal information that comes from the body to the spinal cord all comes into this part here. So it's really, really important. So we have our grey matter and our white matter. And so with the grey matter there, that's where the information is sent up to the brain. Okay, so next we're going to look at the peripheral nervous system. So we have looked at this in class already, and we know there's two main parts of the peripheral nervous system. So we have the somatic, which is all our voluntary movements, and then we have our visceral, or the autonomic part of the nervous system. So when we look at the voluntary part of the nervous system, that contains all the nerves that branch off, from the spinal cord. It goes to the skin, it goes to our joints, it goes to our muscles, and it helps with, muscle contraction. So if we need to move about, we need to get out of a situation, our muscles are going to contract via that voluntary system. And then the cell bodies of that motor neuron, they lie within the central nervous system, but their axons are in the peripheral nervous system. Okay, so the motor neuron, remember, carries information away to allow motor control and motor movement. The autonomic system is involuntary, and we did talk about that the other day as well. So its neurons, innervate the organs, in our internal organs, that we don't really want to sit there thinking about all day. We don't want to sit there thinking, okay, heartbeat or lungs breathe. So that does it for us. It also initiates our blood vessels working. So along with that, we're carrying oxygen, nutrients, carbon dioxide. We're looking at immunity cells, hormones, all those sorts of things are being released into and through our blood vessels without us thinking. And then also our glands. So we are involuntarily releasing hormones via the endocrine system out to wherever they need to go, their target cells. Okay, so it controls our blood pressure as well, our heartbeat, and also any contractions within our intestinal organs. So stomach contractions, we're looking at, the liver, muscles around the liver and all sorts of organs working, our intestines, contractions through there. So it's got quite an important job. And it's when, the brain is damaged that sends out the messages to the peripheral nervous system via the autonomic system, where, there can be quite a lot of problems. So the diagram here is basically to show you, as we looked at the other day. You've got one system is working as the fight or flight, and the other system is the rest and digest. So we have the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system. So as one is increasing, the other one is decreasing. You know, the body needs so much energy to be able to carry out each of these particular actions, that if both systems were increasing at the same time, it's just going to cause too much. It's the body's not going to be able to stay in homeostasis. So we're always trying to get that stable internal environment. So we always have one doing the opposite of the other. So just to have a look at some of the examples here. So as the parasympathetic system is constricting the airway, okay, the sympathetic system is relaxing the airway. You can see that there. When we look at digestion, the parasympathetic system stimulates digestion. So that begins that digestive process. So that's going to be in the rest and digest section. And on this side, on the sympathetic, we have inhibiting digestion. And the other day I gave the example of that fight or flight. It just takes too much energy to digest food. So that particular mechanism is actually shut down. So it's inhibited through this sympathetic system when we go into the fight or flight. So that way we can put all our energy into our, blood pressure and heart rate and breathing rate and that kind of thing. We don't have to waste energy on breaking food down. Okay, so that just gives you a little bit of an example as well of each of those. You can have a little look at that diagram. If you can somehow make it bigger, do so and see how that works. Okay, so now we're going to look at the axons that carry information up and down the spinal cord, through the brain, through the skin. So they're nerves basically, and we have a couple of different main nerves. So we have afferent ones, which are up here, and the afferent axons carry information, or afferent neurons carry information, to the brain where it needs to go, and the efferent carry information from. Okay, so the axons from the sensory nerves are afferent. So these ones are going to the brain. Okay, the axons from the central nervous system to the muscles and glands are the efferent ones. So they're coming from the brain. Okay, so that's how you need to remember the two different ones there. So, just make sure you remember the difference between the two. But if you have a look at this picture, you can actually see that it has a lot of it has the same, basically, organelles that all the other cells we looked at last year have. So let's have a little look in here. You've got our nucleus in the centre there. You've got lots of mitochondria, because if you think about how quickly these nerve impulses need to travel around the body, there needs a lot of energy to do that. And if we look at a neuron that's inside the brain, our brain pretty much takes up the most amount of energy that we produce every single day. So it's really important that neurons, especially in the brain, have a lot of these mitochondria. You've got your ribosomes here, so they need to be making proteins to, help with the nerve impulses travelling along. You've got microtubules, you've got smooth ER, Golgi apparatus, in the neuronal membrane, and down here we're talking about axons. Okay, that becomes the body of the actual neuron. So you can see here there are several different neurons all there, and they all, when I say connect, they don't literally connect with each other. They have a gap in between, but there's so many that need to communicate between each other constantly throughout the day. All right, so just continuing on with some of the bigger parts of the brain now. So we're still with the central nervous system here. So looking at the forebrain. So the brain is actually divided up into several parts. And I did get you to research some of the lobes of the brain. Now these are some of the different areas of the brain, and they all make up different, well, they all have different processes that they need to be in control of. So the forebrain basically picks up perceptions. It picks up our conscious awareness, our cognition, it's our cognitive behaviour, and all our voluntary actions. So if that part of the brain was to be damaged, someone gets hit on the head, you see a lot of sports that involve, boxing or football where they're tackling and, have head clashes and that sort of thing. They actually have problems with their cognitive behaviour later on in life, and also their voluntary actions. So sometimes they find it hard to be able to carry out the same movements voluntarily that they could actually do before, just because the front of their brain or their forebrain has been hit, or damaged so many times. Same with people in car accidents. If they, hit their head at the front, so the forebrain there, that can be damaged as well. So there's lots of interconnections in there. So I have mentioned before, not only are there sensory and motor neurons, there's also interneurons as well. So that travels or gets information to travel in between the sensory and motor neurons. So we have interconnections inside the forebrain that have sensory and motor neuron connections down towards the brainstem and the spinal cord. So it moves through there. The forebrain also contains the cerebral cortex, and that cerebral cortex has many sensory pathways. So you think of all the senses that we have, vision, hearing, taste and touch and all that sort of thing, are picked up via the forebrain. Again, so if it's damaged, we can have problems with our senses, with our interpretation of sight and hearing and all that kind of thing. The hypothalamus is also within the sort of area of the forebrain, and that's one of the most important parts of the autonomic nervous system. That's where that fight or flight mechanism originates from. Our heart rate, temperature, breathing rate, all those sorts of things are in the hypothalamus. So the forebrain is a very important part of the brain for a lot of our automatic responses, as well as our voluntary actions as well. That hypothalamus, which is in the forebrain, is also connected to the pituitary gland. So when we do the endocrine system, you will see that the pituitary gland is probably one of the most important glands in the body. It sends out a lot of the hormones, or it sends messages to other glands in the body to release hormones. So we'll get into that when we do the endocrine system, but very important. Okay, so I couldn't fit a picture of the forebrain on the other page, so I've just put one here. So this is the forebrain, and it's been sectioned off. So all this sort of section here is the forebrain. So the hypothalamus will fit sort of just in that forebrain. So the next bit we're looking at is the midbrain. So it's sort of sectioned off around here. Okay, and that's really important because it takes all our input that the forebrain picks up and it starts to interpret it in the midbrain. So we have, input from our eyes. It helps with the movement of our eyes. It connects our ear to a part of the brain called the thalamus, not the hypothalamus, just the thalamus, which allows us to, interpret sound, etc. And also takes information, all that information to the thalamus. So eyes as well. Helps to regulate our consciousness and our mood, as well as pleasure. So if people have damage to this part of the brain, they could have a lot of trouble controlling their moods. We all go through different stages of moods, daily, weekly, hourly in some cases. So we can have damage to that, but also to pleasure as well. So we have a pleasure and pain sort of centre where we can interpret that information and determine which sort of sensation is pleasurable and which one is painful. Very important. And the last one we're going to look at is the hindbrain, so the back part of the brain, and it sort of goes down towards the back bottom end of the brain. So down there it contains a section called the pons, the medulla or medulla, however you want to pronounce it, oblongata, and the medulla. And it takes all the information from the forebrain and takes it down to the spinal cord. So that's why it's sort of down the bottom near the cerebellum. So all the information that comes from the forebrain or the midbrain goes down to the hindbrain at the bottom, and then that all links to the brain stem and takes info down the spinal cord. It also processes a lot of our sensory information down there as well. So we pick up that sensory information, or before we relay that information out to the rest of the body, so we know what actions to take, it will then sort of interpret that and process it as well. So tell us what it is. So again, that looks at our voluntary movement. It also helps to regulate the autonomic nervous system. It gives us information about our body position as well. So if we look at, how we balance, how we stand up, proprioception. Some of you may have heard of that if you do, exercise science, and looking at how, we can feel where our body is and perceive where our body is. That's all done through the hindbrain. It also looks at, because of that proprioception, basically, if the bottom or the hindbrain were to be damaged, then it will be really, really hard to coordinate anything, really, because it's to do with your coordination. So you become, if you're not already an unco, you will become one, but also inaccurate movements as well. And you see people that have been in, some kind of accident or something like that that's had damage to the bottom part of their brain, especially if you look at those stupid coward punches that are going on at the moment. A lot of the damage, because they're getting hit from behind, or they're falling down onto the side of their head or whatever, is down there. And you see people who have survived those have a lot of trouble coordinating their walking again. So babies, when they're born, up for the first 2 years, are making all these new neural pathways down in their hindbrain, getting them to coordinate their arms and their legs and enable them to walk. Okay, so we've also got the pons down there that helps take information to the cerebral cortex. Then with the medulla that's down there, we have auditory nerves that pass from the ear and the cochlea. So it picks up information, and it also helps to pick up information on taste and touch as well. Okay, so very, very important. And just to finish off this last little bit, we've got a little bit more on the spinal cord. So I mentioned before the dorsal nerves and the ventral root. So just a reminder there that the dorsal horn receives information down here. So it travels in through the spinal cord, and the ventral horn projects, which is down the bottom here, information out. Now, one thing to note as well, we're talking about, information that's actually picked up from, touching something or temperature, and it's travelled up to the brain to be interpreted. If it's a reflex arc, so I'll just write this here, because this is quite important. A reflex arc is probably the quickest sort of neuronal response that our body has, and it's a protective thing. So if we touch something that's like really, really hot or really sharp, we need to protect our body from further damage. The response is going to be so quick, and you heard of reflexes before, that the message doesn't even go up to the brain to be interpreted. So we'll pick up, just say, you've got your hand there, that's my diagram of a hand, it's very complex, and you've got a pin that's meant to be a pin, and you put your hand on the pin. That information is relayed so quickly, all it does is travel through the dorsal horn in the spinal cord, through the ventral horn, and then back up to the hand to move it away from the pin. So it actually bypasses the brain altogether, because we need to protect our hand. If we put our hand on something hot, we don't want to damage the nerve endings around our hand, so we need to move it away really quickly. So instead of travelling up to the brain there, it just travels through the dorsal horn, then through the ventral horn, straight back to the hand. That's why our reactions are actually so quick when we do, touch something. And that's it for this.